Let's learn about artificial intelligence, AI, and radiology. What is AI? Here's a Venn diagram showing the different concepts. AI is a subfield of computer science devoted to creating systems to perform tasks that ordinarily require human intelligence. Machine learning is a subfield of AI where computers are trained to perform tasks without explicit programming. Classically, humans engineer features by which a computer can learn to distinguish patterns of data. However, many complex computer vision tasks typically it's not clear, even to an expert, how to define the optimal image features for machine learning algorithm to use. Thus, it's desirable for a computer to not only learn the mappings of features to desired outputs, but to learn and optimize the features themselves. Representative learning is a type of machine learning where no feature engineering is used. Instead, the computers learn the features by which to classify the provided data. Deep learning is a type of representation learning where the learned features are compositional or hierarchical. Complex representations are expressed in terms of simpler representations. These deep learning systems propose an end-to-end approach by learning simple features, such as signal intensity, edges, and textures, as components of more complex features, such as shapes, lesions, or organs. This leverages the compositional nature of images. Classic machine learning depends on carefully designed features, requiring human expertise and complicated task-specific optimization. Deep learning bypasses feature engineering by taking advantage of large quantities of data and flexible hierarchical models. The red boxes represent components learned by fitting a model to example data. Deep learning allows learning and end-to-end mapping from the input to the output. Success in training the deep multi-layered neural networks was limited in the past by the difficulty of the underlying optimization problem, as well as the limits of the computer hardware of that time. As a result, research was directed towards kernel methods and decision trees. Other techniques. Why is AI becoming popular now? Well, the availability of large quantities of labeled data, inexpensive and powerful parallel computing hardware, and improvements in training techniques and architecture all contribute. How is computer vision different than humans? Here's one example. A human expert can easily classify this image as an image of the right kidney. But why is it hard for a computer? Instead of shades of gray, a computer, quote-unquote, sees a matrix of numbers representing pixel brightness. Computer vision typically involves computing the presence of numerical patterns, features in this matrix, then applying machine learning algorithms to distinguish images on the basis of these features. Computer vision tasks carry out many algorithms which are based on features, classifiers, and shape extraction methods. Features describe the appearance of organs and points of interest in medical images. Classifiers integrate features to output a decision. Shape extraction and regularization recover a consistent shape despite classification noise. Here's a conceptual analogy between biologic neurons and artificial neurons for neural networks. The concept of a neural network stems from biology. In the visual cortex, there is a neural network able to detect edges from what is seen by the retina. When the inner parts of the receptors are activated simultaneously, the simple cell neuron integrates the three signals and transmits an edge detection signal. In our artificial neural network, there are interconnected artificial neurons. Each neuron implements a simple classifier model where there's an output of a decision signal based on a weighted sum of evidences, as well as an activation function, which integrates signals from previous neurons. Hundreds of these basic computing units are assembled together. Then the weights of the network are trained via a learning algorithm where pairs of input signals and desired output decisions are presented, much like the brain. The basis for most deep learning research is the artificial neural network. The deep aspect refers to the multi-layer architecture of these networks, containing multiple hidden layers of nodes between the input and output nodes. This example has 3 input nodes, 2 hidden layers, and 2 output nodes. By stacking multiple layers, a network can represent a hierarchy of features that are increasingly complex in composition of low-level input features. This models higher levels of abstraction in the data. Obtaining a prediction from a sample observation, such as an image, using a neural network involves computing sequentially the activation of each node of each layer. We start from the input layer up to the output layer. This is called forward propagation. In the setting of a classification task, the activation of the output layer is submitted through a softmax function. This is a normalized squashing function which maps a vector of real values to a probability distribution. Thus, the softmax function converts raw activation signals from the output layer to target class probabilities. Here is the learning process. Weights used by artificial neurons amount to millions, billions of parameters within a deep neural network. These parameters, which are randomly initialized, are then progressively adjusted via an optimization algorithm called gradient descent. When presenting a series of training samples to the network, a loss function measures quantitatively how far the prediction is to the target class or regression value. All parameters, which are just different weights and biases, are then slightly updated in the direction that will favor minimization of the loss function. Complex tasks such as image classification within an efficient model architecture are addressed based on the following components: convolutions, activation functions, pooling, and softmax function. For each neuron to consider each pixel of a 512 by 512 image as input values to a neural network, an enormous amount of computer memory would be required. Instead, only the parameters of specialized filter operators called convolutions are learned. This type of network relies on convolution operations, linear application of a filter or kernel to local neighborhoods of points in an input. This mathematical operation describes the multiplication of local neighbors of a given pixel by a small array of learned parameters called a kernel. Typically, multiple different convolutional filters are learned for each layer, yielding many different feature maps, each highlighting where different characteristics of the input image of the previous hidden layer have been detected. A key component of deep neural networks is the activation function, a nonlinear function that is applied to the outputs of linear operations such as convolutions. Stacking these allows the input to be mapped to a representation that is linearly separable by a linear classifier. The activation function is inspired by observations regarding the basic behavior of biologic neurons. The role of an activation function in a neural network layer is typically that of a selection function, which allows some features to pass through to the output. Historically, sigmoidal and hyperbolic tangent functions were used, as they were considered to be biologically plausible. Today, most CNNs, convolutional neural networks, now use a rectified linear unit, ReLU, in their hidden layers. This activation function is perfectly linear for positive inputs, passing them through unchanged, and blocks negative inputs, i.e. evaluates to 0. An additional component of convolutional neural networks is the downsampling or pooling operation. This operation groups feature map activations into a lower resolution feature map. Downsampling increases the effective scope or receptive field of subsequent filters. Moreover, combined with convolutions, this operation also reduces the model's sensitivity to small shifts of the objects, since deeper layers rely increasingly on spatially low resolution but contextually rich information. An added benefit of downsampling is the reduction of a model's memory footprint. For example, the size of each feature map will decrease by 4 each time a pooling operator is used, 2 by 2. A common form of downsampling is max pooling, which pooling region into a lower resolution feature map. Successive pooling operations result in maps that have been progressively lower resolution, but represent increasingly rich information on the structure of interest. Here's a diagram integrating several concepts outlined in previous figures into a general diagram. Starting on the left, the input image is submitted to a series of convolutions with learned kernels, producing a stack of feature maps containing low-level features, such as edges and corners. These feature maps are then downsampled by a max pooling layer and further submitted to another set of learned convolutions, producing higher-level features, such as parts of organs. Convolutions and max pooling layers can be stacked alternately until the network is deep enough to properly capture the structure of the image that is salient for the task at hand. Higher-level features are typically flattened into a single vector to perform the final classification or regression for the target task. Stacking multiple convolutional and max pooling layers allows the model to learn a hierarchy of feature representations, while neurons close to the input image will be activated by the presence of edges and corners formed by a few pixels. Neurons located deeper in the network will be activated by combinations of edges and corners that represent characteristic parts of organs and eventually whole organs. At each successive level of representation, neurons gain a larger representative field in the input image. The final classification task thus relies on a rich set of hidden features that represent a large receptive field and integrate multi-scale information in a meaningful way. In a fully connected layer, each neuron is connected to all neurons in the previous layer. Fully connected layers allow reasoning about the entire content of the image. Alternatively, the last layer of the network before the final classification layer, i.e. the pre-softmax layer, also provides insight on the CNN. The pre-softmax layer represents the whole image as a high-dimensional feature vector, such as 4096 element feature vector. Since it is impossible to directly visualize such a high-dimensional vector, we apply dimensionality reduction techniques to project the vectors into a two-dimensional space that we can easily visualize. A common dimensionality reduction technique for this setting is the T-stochastic neighbor embedding, TSNE, which tends to preserve Euclidean distances. That is, nearby vectors in the high-dimensional space are close to each other in the low-dimensional projection. Here's a map showing the distribution of the 4096 element vector to which the training case of ultrasound images with organ labels were mapped. Areas of overlap correspond to potential areas of classification confusion. For example, there is significant overlap between longitudinal views of the left and right kidney and between longitudinal and transverse views of the right hepatic lobe. Maps like these provide insight into the performance of the neural network classification. To train a model, we need data, and there are two general types of machine learning approaches that differ in the type of data that is needed to train them: supervised and unsupervised. Supervised is labeled data. For example, machine learning a system for classifying renal tumors. A particular tumor image may be labeled renal cell cancer. In unsupervised learning, the data examples are not labeled. They're not annotated. Instead, the model aims to cluster images into groups based on their inherent variability. The machine learning algorithm then tries to discover some structure in the data that might be used to solve some task, such as classification or segmentation. A hybrid is called semi-supervised learning. Computer vision datasets are very high in magnitude. In some cases, the dataset acquisition costs can be reduced by crowdsourcing, relying entirely on outsourced labels. But this may be problematic as they might not be the most accurate. Another way to expand the dataset is through data augmentation. This artificially enlarges the size of a small dataset. The idea is to apply random transformations to the data that do not change the appropriateness of the label assignments. Transformations include flipping, rotating, translating, zooming, skewing, and elastic deformation. Thus, these image variants enlarge the size of the training dataset, but preserve the important features. It's standard practice in machine learning to divide available data into three subsets: a training set, a validation set, and a test set. The training set is used to train and optimize the parameters of the neural network. The training involves repeatedly running training images through it, and using the errors to adjust the weights of the network connections. The validation set is used to monitor the performance of the model during the training process. This dataset should also be used to perform model selection. The validation data is the best proxy we can have about the model performance on the test set. Once all the parameters of the model are fixed, we can measure its performance on the test set. This set is used only at the very end to report the final model performance. Designing neural network architectures requires consideration of numerous parameters that are not learned by the model, i.e. hyperparameters. This includes the network topology, the number of filters at each layer, and the optimization parameters. Hyperparameters are typically selected through random search, a lengthy process where each configuration is instantiated and trained. Once we have a proper data set and a neural network architecture, we can proceed to learning the model parameters. An important machine learning pitfall is overfitting. This is where a model learns idiosyncratic statistical variations of the training set rather than generalizable patterns for a particular problem. Overfitting is usually detected by analysis of model accuracy on the training and validation sets. If we evaluate the model extensively on the validation set, we can overfit both the training and validation data. A model overfits because it has too many parameters and can memorize the training data at the expense of being able to generalize to new data. If the model is overfit, we should consider reducing its capacity or flexibility, or adding more data. End-to-end training of a modern deep learning model typically requires a great deal of computation. The success of deep convolutional neural networks was made possible by the development of inexpensive parallel computing hardware in the form of GPUs, graphic processing units. While GPUs were initially created for computer gaming, they have demonstrated their utility as a flexible hardware for general-purpose parallel computation. They're typically considered essential for training large, modern deep neural networks in a reasonable amount of time. The speedup is substantial, often 10 to 40 times higher. For example, we can do a test in a few days rather than weeks or months. Many software frameworks are now available. They are free and open source, and some include TensorFlow, Keras, Theano, Torch, Caffe, CNTK. These implement efficient low-level functions from which developers can describe neural network architecture with very few lines of code. This allows the programmers to focus on higher-level architectural issues. These libraries allow researchers to efficiently tap into available computing resources, such as GPUs. Deep learning has demonstrated impressive performance on tasks related to natural images, such as photographs. Now, a lot of these techniques are applied to medical imaging. Those techniques include classification, segmentation, and detection. In our next video, part 2 of AI in radiology, we'll discuss the clinical problems and how these techniques are used. Please subscribe for more awesome anatomy and radiology videos.